My name is Chad Holmes. I'm a senior mobile solution architect for Red Hat. To get started, who before today knew that Red Hat had a mobile offering of any kind? Wow, more hands than normal. Okay. Who that didn't know is surprised that Red Hat has a mobile offering? All right, cool. I found that audiences have roughly a 60% ability to raise their hands. So thank you for those that participated. So I'm going to talk a little bit about what we call MAD for mobile, Microservices, Agile, and DevOps for mobile, and how mobile and these approaches to development are converging in a really nice time. To set the stage for that a little bit, though, I want to talk about one thing, and there's this concept of a mobile center of excellence, and I can talk about it for hours on end in the hallway. This isn't going to be much of a sales pitch. If you want one of those, again, I can do that for hours on end in the hallway. But the thought behind mobile apps is that they should start to become smaller, easier to replicate, easier to develop, really focused on what your internal customers, your internal users need them to do. So think of it as field workers that are out in the field reporting something, recording something, reading meters, whatever the case may be. Some analysts call them CLAs. Has anyone ever heard the term CLA? Okay, that's a crappy little app. We don't necessarily agree with that, right? We like to call them micro apps instead. There's this big debate whether you should have one killer app that has 150 screens that costs a lot of money. Obviously, you know what side of that argument I'm on. The other is you should have a bunch of small apps that you can reuse components, et cetera. So I'm going to talk about the smaller reusable components as we go through today. So the thought behind this is you should have small apps. They don't cost a lot of money. They don't take a lot of time to develop. In some cases, hours or days. Typically, 6 to 12 weeks. They're not necessarily going to live for decades, right? If for no other reason, the device in our pockets are going to change in the next year or two, you'll have to update them for that. And you don't have to have them be big monoliths, right? We don't need 150 screens to capture everything our company does. We need 20 apps with 3 or 4 screens each, and we find that works much better. So again, I can talk about mobile center of excellences all day, but just think in terms of, as I speak about the rest of this presentation, a core group within your organization that has a good core mobile skill set, both for the front-end app development and the back-end integration and project management. It can be as few as 3 or 4 people, but the focus of their group is to develop a lot of apps, develop them quickly, support them, et cetera. So with that in mind, I want to talk a little bit about how we actually help people achieve that and what we see our customers doing to scale out development there. And it breaks down into 3 categories. One, the adoption of microservices, right? Small composable services. Second is an agile approach. I think we all have heard of Agile. A lot of us are using Agile. The reality is waterfall and similar methods still exist in a lot of places, and we still see some mobile development shops trying to develop using waterfall methodologies. We need to get away from that for these smaller projects. So I'll talk a little bit about that. And then we'll talk a little bit about DevOps everywhere from what the heck is it to how the heck does it help with mobile. So starting first with microservices. The traditional approach of almost any development, whether it be mobile or otherwise, is what we've all grown up doing in some way, right? You're working with systems of records, often big data centers in the background. You have one big monolithic app that you want for the project. It's tying back into that system or those systems, and everything is in that one sphere. Reusing those components is often very difficult, right? I was talking to someone earlier. We were talking about SOA and how hard we've all worked to take SOA best practices and implement them, and we've all kind of had this result, right? This is the next step on that. Arguable point, but really this is the next step. Let's make smaller, composable, reusable services and do it in a way that others get advantage from them. So we're trying to get away from the heavy, costly development with integration and trying to move to something more agile, more mobile. So we're talking about working with systems of engagement, right? These things are great at not only viewing data, but also submitting data. So we don't have to go and write things on a form, then type it in at the end of the day, and then that goes back to a back-end system, then we run a batch process that night. Let's put it in here and have it update the back-end system as soon as we can. We want to focus on simple, nimble apps. 3 or 4 pages in a lot of cases is all you need. I work with utilities, I work with people installing elevators, things like that. If you have gloves on your hands and you're trained in being an elevator installer, You don't want to have to pull this out and type in things all the time. You want to take your glove off once at the end of the job, type in what you did, and have everything else just work. And that's what we see a lot of customers doing with mobile these days. And finally, these need to be affordable, right? We don't want to spend millions and millions of dollars on apps. If you're creating Angry Birds or Pokemon or any of those, yes, spend millions and millions of dollars on that because that's your product, that's your entire company. The reality is everyone in this room probably works for a company that does something else with people in the field to make money, and we're all just here to support those people in the field. So let's give them the tools they need and reduce costs while we do so. So again, I mentioned microservices is just SOA 2.0. That's not really the case. So first of all, microservices are small and composable services, whereas SOA didn't really put size limitations on what the services should be. Microservices do. They should be small and they should be lightweight. They're responsible for small pieces of work. So instead of having one big service that does a bunch of stuff, we might have 3 or 4 services that we chain together. There's some arguments against that, but what we're finding, particularly in the mobile field, is that approach works really, really well because those small components can also be reused for many different mobile projects. The perfect example that I use all the time is some kind of AAA OAuth connector, right? You write an authentication scheme or service once, and you use it throughout your organization. There's no need to keep writing it over and over. There's no need to keep testing it over and over. Write it once and reuse it many times. And then finally, the microservices are going to talk over dumb pipes. They don't care about the data going back and forth as long as they have smart endpoints, knowing what to do with the data when it's sending and when it's getting there. So let's just get the data over the air as quickly as we can, hopefully in really, really small data loads, and I'll talk about that in a second. But let's just get the data to where it needs to be so that device, that endpoint, can figure out what it needs to do. Microservices are not monoliths. Remember, we're not doing this. We're doing little chunks all the way down. They're not a silver bullet, right? If you're telling me you're still developing for green screens in a hospital system, say, or some old system where you've invested decades and tens of millions of dollars in that system, completely switching over to microservices because it's a hot, new, cool technology or approach may not be the way to go. So I'm here to convince you it's a really good thing to start thinking about, particularly in the mobile space, but do know that there's always a tool for the job, so choose the right tool when you're doing it. And again, it's not just SOA. SOA is great, it has its place. We all did okay-ish with it. This is a different approach. It's more for those lightweight. So the other thing when we think about not only microservices but mobile is that mobile is very different. Obviously, I'm not good at graphics. I apologize for that. So first of all, if you look at the shift from browser-based technologies to mobile, browser-based technologies are actually really fast to deploy, right? You launch an error or war, it takes X number of minutes or hours, and it's up there and running. I refresh my page and it's there. Also, they have much higher performance rates. I can go in, I can pretty reliably know what a wired network connection is going to operate at unless there's some kind of outage. Mobile is the exact opposite of that, right? Release cycles are dependent on what we're actually releasing through. If we're releasing a public app, the Apple Store, for example, is notorious for taking 1 to 3 weeks just to approve an app, never mind getting it out there. Even if you're doing internal development and releasing through technologies like MDMs, Mobile Iron, AirWatch, et cetera, you're going to find that those can take in the order of days to actually launch. So when we're developing mobile apps, while they actually might get more data from the field quicker, the launch experience is still a little bit slower than we've come to expect. They're also doing a lot of things over the air. So if we're talking about networks that are less than 4G, and a lot of us are used to 4G in day-to-day life, but again, think about the people in the field doing whatever it is that your company does to make money. They're probably in forests, they're probably on the road, they're probably on the outskirts of reliable networks, and that starts to drive down connectivity and reliability of those networks. So we're moving from the machines on our laps that have great performance, great launch, to devices that take a little bit longer to get everything done. Updating is different. I mentioned this earlier. We're moving from hours to days and weeks in some kind. Sometimes I'm sure that will cut down over time, but it's the reality of mobile right now. It just takes a long time to get apps out there. Performance is different, and this is really important. So we actually have 2 bars here. If you look at the blue bar, that's where if you're implementing client-side business logic on the app. So I dial home, I get a huge data load sent over the air to me. In some cases, it's XML, so it's really heavy. And then I'm relying on the device to actually parse that data and perform the business logic. There's a lot of wasted time in there, particularly if we're looking at older networks. With 4G, it starts to catch up. But if we're looking at 3G or Edge, that takes significant amounts of time. And when you realize that you're making multiple calls and requests and responses back and forth, that kills the usability of devices. And if there's one way to make an app fail, it's to make it unusable. It's to make it unresponsive. People will stop using it on the first or second attempt. So we need to make sure there's some kind of quick response. So if we take a microservices-driven approach to integrating with backend systems for mobile devices, particularly on non-4G networks, we can see that by having business logic done in either the back end or done in what we call cloud code, some kind of intermediary layer, we can speed up the turnaround time. Without doing anything really fancy on this, other than treating it as a UI and UX layer, we can actually do a lot more processing and give much better performance. So mobile's different in that way, in that we can, if we take the right approach, make these devices work really, really well and respond really quickly. So in short, microservices are great for mobile. They're really good for a lot of other projects as well, right? Red Hat has a whole suite that's driven by microservices, so we're really happy about that. But for mobile, they're critical. Anyone that's going and just even doing web services with XML going over the air, we try to teach them a better way of doing that, even if it's just translation in the back end. They're suited to mobile, and they're different from developing monolith. It's not just give me the data feed and I'll figure out how to display it. There's a little bit more to do there. Questions about microservices? Cool. Yeah, go ahead.
So, what problems you encounter dealing with microservices? For monolithic, what kind of problem you encounter?
Data access is always number one. How do we work with the security groups? How do we work with the firewall people? How do we work with the owners of that Oracle database or whatever's in the back end to get the access and then to have it reliable over time, right? So they're already exposing it somehow. How do we work with them within the confines of your organization to actually tap into that? Once we've gotten past that hurdle, it's a matter of the biggest concern we see is people understand they need to do microservices, but even more apparent is they need to get their project done today, right? They need to roll an app out very, very quickly. And while microservices would be great, we need to get it out soon. So it's really making sure that our customers are thinking not only about the delivery today or this week or next month, but also putting in the right infrastructure today to help them grow their practice over time. That's by far the biggest challenge we see.
How do you deal with transactions on microservices? Because each service call could be a separate service.
Yep, absolutely. So the way we do it is we actually, our mobile platform has a Node.js-based microservices layer, right? So we use, is everyone familiar with Node? All right, so Node.js is server-side JavaScript. It's event loop driven, excuse me. So you just send a request to the event loop. It processes the request and returns data as it goes. So if we have the case where we're integrating with 3 or 4 systems, we'll expose 3 or 4 microservices, send the requests when we have enough data to do it, and then let the loop return the data as needed. So it's a matter of getting it on the loop and getting data back. It's asynchronous, so it might not always be the smoothest in order responses that you want, but we find that for the most part, if developed correctly on the front end for handling that data, it's actually pretty useful.
No, what I mean is transaction comes up. I will or nothing transaction comes up. If the client submit a request, that particular request in turn calls some other microservices. So now you get distributed transaction. So how do you deal with all or nothing?
All or nothing? I'm sorry, I guess I'm not quite grasping. Are you talking about large data loads or multiple calls or?
No, if your client wants to do, say, let's submit start a claim process,
yep.
So to speak. So that in turn, that initial call to make a database call, and then afterwards they make another microservice call, which could be in another server.
Right.
Now you get distributed transaction.
Right.
So if So if the second one fails, how do you do the first one?
Okay, so yeah, I got you now. So it comes down to sequences of transactions and what happens with error handling or business logic. So there's a couple things there. One is choosing the right systems for the job, right? So we talked about BPM and BRMS before. If you have a bunch of business rules we have to go through, we want to tie into a system like that. We don't want to replace systems like that. If instead it comes down to error handling, or a process gets kicked off, but then there's an error because a record doesn't exist or something, it really comes down to what are the business rules that are going to dictate how we handle that. So it's more about development and logic in that development, whether it be on the app side, the service side, or that cloud code side I talked about before. If you want to talk some more about it after, I'll be happy to. Any other questions? All right, cool. So next I want to talk a little bit about Agile methodology. So I know we've all heard about Agile. So most of us are probably implementing it in some way. But the reality is there is still a very strong waterfall or similar mindset out there, right? We see a lot of project plans come in that say, we're going to do Agile, but the reality is once you look at it, there's a test cycle at the very end and a dev cycle and planning cycle up front, and it's not really as responsive as it needs to be. So when we talk about Agile development, there's three simple truths. One is you'll almost never know all the requirements at the beginning of a project. I've seen a couple government projects, case studies where they're building a jet fighter or something and they know everything, and there's documents this high that fill up a whole room where they know all the requirements. But for the most part, any project you're working on, you're not going to have every single requirement up front. Whatever you're going to gather for requirements are probably going to change, particularly with mobile apps as we start putting them in executives' hands and other people's hands, and they're trying to figure out what looks good, what doesn't. Those change quite frequently. And there's always going to be more to do than time and money will allow, right? Particularly with mobile apps, we always get the response of, oh, if we just had that feature, or we just had this feature. Particularly as we get into the hands of users, there's always one more thing, and we just don't have the time and money to do it, never mind the requirements up front. So what that means is we need some kind of approach that's time-boxed, it's iterative, and it changes incrementally, right? Effectively, focus on user story, continuously deliver. Instead of having one big delivery at the end every 6 months and hoping it meets most of the people's need, let's get it out there every couple weeks. Let's put it in an iterative cycle. So we need something quick, we need something responsive, we need something that's focused on releases. So when we talk about Agile, a lot of different things pop up, right? The reality is everyone seems to do it a little bit different way, and you can start very big Agile religious battles over my way's better, your way's better. No, that's not really the case, right? There's a lot of ways to do it. You have to pick best what works for your organization. Again, it comes down to putting the tools and processes in place that allow your developers to do the job at hand. The very basic thing to look at for Agile is these five points. You make a list, you size up what you have to do, right? There's this great thing where you go and everyone gets around a table and you say, I think this is 1 point, 3 points, 5 points. They get an average of points, and it tells you, hey, this is probably going to be a 3-day effort, something like that. So you size things up, you set priorities, right? Even if it's a 1-day effort, will it give us anything worthwhile or not? You start executing, and then you update as you go. There's this concept of just kind of embracing change, and more importantly, embracing failure. Knowing at some point, either the priorities are going to be wrong, the requirements are going to be wrong, or you're just going to have a much harder task at hand than you thought. Know that that's going to pop up at some point going in, embrace it, and then work to correct it once it does pop up. So when we talk about Agile, it's different in a bunch of ways. It's iterative, it's adaptive. Roles tend to blur, right? And we'll get into this as we talk about DevOps as well. But you're not just a developer. You're not just a tester. You're communicating between teams a lot more. And we start to see roles blur significantly more. Oops. To put it another way, we're taking a traditional kind of waterfall approach where we do analysis, then design, then we code and test, and we're just flipping on its side, right? We're doing all those things together at once, and we're doing them over and over and over. We're not doing everything over 6 months in very chunked time frames. We're doing everything over 6 to 12 weeks in a lot of cases, and those chunks are really, really small, and they often can overlap. I think this slide does a really, really good job of showing some of the benefits of Agile, particularly if you're like me and you grew up learning waterfall methodologies. The result of this is also really cool. Instead of having really large payloads that are delivered over on the right with high peaks for success but also low valleys for failure, you have much smaller payloads, much smaller peaks of success, but much smaller valleys of failure. So you can fail fast, you can fix fast, and you can get more out there. So over time, this has been proven over and over to actually deliver a much more reliable product, something that customers like a lot more. So since we're completely biased, and my whole point here is to convince you that Agile is better than Waterfall, right? Here's a good little table to compare the two. Waterfall tends to have lesser quality than Agile. I don't know if I'd call it poor, but lesser quality, right? Big payloads where here's what you're getting whether you like it or not. Let us know where we can fix it again in 6 months versus, hey, a new feature is on your phone. You probably didn't even know it was coming. Let us know if you like it or not. Visibility, you have to wait to the end on Waterfall, right? Again, it's that big burst. Did we hit everything? With Agile, you're continually looking at what you're pumping out, and you're doing it so quickly that even if you do fail on a massive scale, it's only a couple more weeks before you deliver a new payload, and people can often wait a couple more weeks. Risk is really high with Waterfall, right? Really, really low with Agile for those time frames, if nothing else. And then change in Waterfall, you have a set schedule, right? We're delivering in 6 months whether you don't want it or not, and we're starting testing 6 weeks before that. There's not a lot of change, maybe a day or two in some cases. Agile, we completely embrace change. We know things are going to change. If there's a blocker, let's rally around to figure out how we can resolve that blocker and then move on to the next task. So these aren't all our ideas, by the way. You know, there's an Agile manifesto. There's a whole group that contributes to that. But effectively, we're focusing on individuals and interactions, right? Believe it or not, when we're developing technology, it's not just about the bits and the bytes and how the computers work. We actually have to account for those humans and make sure they're working well together. So it focuses on how do we make them communicate and develop better. How do we release working software instead of a ton of documentation? That's not to say you can't document. In fact, you really should document. We all know that. But how do we get something that's working out in the world so customers can give us feedback and then update that as needed? To the customer point, treating customers like partners, right? We're not selling them something, giving them a payload and say, we hope you like it. If you don't, too bad, we'll try better the next time. Mr. Customer, what do you want? What are you trying to accomplish? How can we help you get there? It doesn't always mean that we're going to do it next week, the week after. It may be 3 or 6 months off still. But understanding what customers need and how we can help them is a really, really big deal. Because if one customer needs it, in a lot of cases, other customers probably need it, and they just haven't said so yet, or realize it themselves. And then it comes down to responding to change over following a plan, right? How do we figure out what's working, what's not, and then respond to that? Any questions about Agile? No? Okay. Finally, DevOps. So can anyone give me a definition of DevOps? Okay. Either you're all really shy or it's the common response I get. I got the other day, I asked that question, I had someone just say ownership. And I was like, if DevOps is one word, we'd all love that because we'd actually know what it is. And he went on to say, you know, it's ownership between the development team and the operations team, and he gave this long, like, 3-minute answer, which was, we all just kind of said, okay, that's more what we think of. The best way I can explain DevOps to my mom, who does nothing in technology, is back when I was in school, if I wanted to build or if I wanted to launch a website, I had to go build the computer, buy the parts, install Linux on it, install a LAMP stack on top of that, then go and develop in Java, then launch it, right? It's everywhere from operations to Java development, configuration of Tomcat, everything in between. The reality is, as we drive more towards containers, as we drive more towards technologies that allow you to launch on top of a server or a container or a VM or whatever you're running in the back end, the line blurs between the development aspect, actually putting the website or the app out there, and the operations aspect, putting up the infrastructure, putting up the back end systems that they run on. So this presentation actually goes a lot better when we have 2 people presenting it, because I just told you how great Agile was. Now I'm telling you Agile is low on the chain of mature organizations that should be more DevOps focused. The reality is you want agile methodologies for your individual projects, and you want to drive your organization towards as many agile methodologies as you want. A really mature organization these days is taking a full DevOps mindset. There's not a lot of those in the world. So if you're full DevOps throughout, congratulations. The reality is you probably have a bunch of stuff scattered throughout, or a bunch of methodologies scattered throughout, excuse me. So the reality is it's the relationship between building, releasing, and operating, right? The same people that are hosting the infrastructure are working very closely, and sometimes are the same people as the ones developing and launching. Doesn't necessarily mean giving all your developers all the keys to production systems and saying, hey, launch away, but it does mean making sure that they have some process in place that allow them to do that. So whenever we're talking with customers, there's often the question of which DevOps tools should we use? The reality is we want you to use the tools that are best for the job. And that answer does not help them at all, right? Because they actually need an actual tool chain to pull it together. So I'm not going to go through everything on here, but there's some common things you need to think of when you're starting to implement or mature your DevOps practices. Continuous integration server, Jenkins and Circle CI are the ones we see pop up the most. Some kind of version control system. Git is incredibly popular. To be very clear, Git is not necessarily GitHub. GitHub is a public online version. You can have private instances of Git. We see that confusion a lot, so I like to clarify it. We do have a mobile application platform and Ansible for DevOps. Again, we can pitch those to you out of the hallway if you want to learn more about them. You're going to need build tools, whether it's for mobile apps, whether it's for websites, anywhere in between. Testing frameworks, monitoring. We really like Nagios for our operations team. It seems to work really, really well. And then for those using Node systems, I'm a huge fan of Node. Our whole mobile organization is, because it's what we're based on. NPM modules, right? NPM modules are just effectively modules that you can find at npmjs.com. There's several 100,000 of them out there. To put that in perspective, when I joined the mobile team about 2.5 years ago, there were 30,000. So there's a ton of Node modules out there, and they continue to grow every day. And those are the real secret to a lot of backend integration and a lot of the cool stuff in Node. There's so many modules out there. They already do the really hard work for you. It's just about finding the right one. And that's one of the reasons, beyond the really cool technical aspects of Node, why Node is so well adopted, is because the community around it just continues to contribute back. We do have, as I mentioned earlier, both our RHMap, our mobile application platform, and Ansible. When it comes to a combination of DevOps and mobile, it's where we really push our customers to, because that's why we're in business. So one thing I like at the top there, actually two things I want to talk about here. One is project creation. It's really important when you're thinking about mobile apps that you're not thinking on a per app basis. From a technology and development standpoint, that's just one small subsection. You have to think about the project. You have to think about the app, the backend systems and microservices to connect to them, and then the business logic in between, as well as any other systems, whether they be BPM, BRMS, databases, et cetera, and how to make them work all together. So it's not about the app. It's certainly not about that monolithic app. It's about how do we bring the right technologies and right systems together to solve the problem at hand. And then the other thing that I want to talk about, and this is a long feature, and again, I'm happy to talk to anyone about our mobile offering out in the hallway, but there's a couple core features of it that I really like to talk about. One is the project I just mentioned. The other is the binary creation, a build farm. Who's actually developed a mobile app in here before? Just a handful of people. So when you're developing mobile apps, you have to play nice with the providers and frameworks at hand. Native iOS apps, Android apps, hybrid apps where you develop in JavaScript and build for multiple platforms. Whenever you build those, you have to follow the rules of provisioning profiles and certificates and things like that. And you have to build, particularly with Apple, on iOS physical hardware. So building that can be tedious if you get beyond one or two people, because while it's easy for me to build on my MacBook, it's not easy for the rest of my team to do so. And it's very easy to lose those certificates and provisioning profiles, particularly if you have to update them every year. So what we've done is we've actually stood up a stack of Mac Minis and other hardware. Most of them are hosted in the middle of the Nevada desert at a hosting facility that we use out there. And we actually offer up the build farm that manages the credentials, manages those provisioning profiles. There's a bunch of other stuff in the platform that helps speed up development and collaboration, but that's the one that's really, really cool because it takes all that confusion out of the build process, even if it's a team of 2 or 3, and just puts it in a much more structured way. So if any of us do talk at some later date, that's going to be one of the first things you see, because while it's not necessarily this huge technology breakthrough, in terms of developers being more effective in scaling out their development, that in itself really helps a ton. So with that to wrap up, taking a mobile center of excellence focus, even if it's just that small handful of people, is really going to help you ramp up your mobile development efforts. It's going to speed up release cycles, right? We actually see this internally while we're not developing mobile apps, right? We're developing a platform. We take the same approach, and since we got acquired about 1.5 years ago, 2 years ago almost now, we've seen significant improvement in our life cycles. We now release without hesitation every month, and it's just huge payloads. It's not like 1 or 2 features, it's dozens of features at this point. So great new release cycles, significantly a better new pace of business. I was talking to one of my colleagues out here earlier, and they're trying to figure out, how do we train the sales team on 4.2 of a release? Well, by the time that we have 4.2 documented and training them up, we'll have 4.3 and 4.4 out the door, right? That's great. It's a new pace that you don't see a whole lot. It's a pain for the sales team to train them up, right? Because they're selling a couple releases behind. But the reality is, if the biggest problem that we have is telling you about all our new features, it's a really, really good problem to have. It's going to help deliver software differently. We were a cloud-first company before we got acquired. We'll be fully on-prem next month, I believe, early next month. So regardless of where we're hosting, you're going to be able to get your apps out the door. You're going to be able to get your cloud code and your back-end logic out the door much more quickly. We're talking hours and days, not weeks and months at this point. And then finally, it gives a greater ROI. So ROI can be really, really hard to calculate, particularly for mobile. And it's not because of the technical aspects. We can actually estimate pretty easily, not easily, with a high degree of accuracy, what the cost of a mobile project is going to be. What we can't estimate is what the value back to your business is going to be, right? We don't always have the business expertise. That's why you guys are in that business. So what we can do is work with teams to understand what the business drivers are, what the hopeful outcome is, and then use the cost and those benefits to calculate ROI. So mobile ROI is difficult, but if we break it down into smaller chunks, it's something we can actually start to calculate pretty easily. And that goes for a lot of other technologies as well. So any questions? All right, I hope it was helpful. If you have any questions, feel free to ping us at Red Hat Mobile or on the Red Hat page. But I thank you for your time today.